This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 to 14. It's the basis for the sermon at the First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, August 9, 2026. It's part of our series called Faith Forward. So let's hear the text from Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. Then Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men as spies secretly from Shittim, saying, "Go, view the land, especially Jericho." So they went out and entered the house of a prostitute, whose name was Rahab, and rested there. But it was told to the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men from the sons of Israel have come here tonight to spy out the land." And the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to spy out all the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. It came about, when it was time to shut the gate at dark, that the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had actually brought them up to the roof and hidden them in the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued them on the road to the Jordan, to the crossing places, and as soon as those who were pursuing them had gone out, they shut the gate. Now before the spies lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have despaired because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you, when you came up out of the land of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard these reports, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in anyone any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord, since I have dealt kindly with you, that you also will deal kindly with my father's household, and give me a pledge of truth, and spare my father and mother, and my brothers and my sisters, and all who belong to them, and save our lives from death." So the men said to her, "Our life for yours, if you do not tell this business of ours. And it shall come about, when the Lord gives us the land, that we will deal kindly and faithfully with you." This is a great passage in the book of Joshua, as it opens shortly after the death of Moses, and Joshua has brought the children of Israel to the eastern bank of the Jordan River. We're going to look at this text in 2 different sections. First, verses 1 through 7, when we're going to talk about the unnamed spies, and then we'll look at verses 8 to 14 with Rahab's confession and her bargain. So in verses 1 to 7, the story of the unnamed spies who remain nameless throughout this story, we pick up with this section in Joshua chapter 2, which is really one of the more well-known and loved sections of the book. It really contains a bit of a spy thriller, not quite like any other in the Bible. So as just an exercise, you might want to just sit down and read Joshua 1 and then skip to chapter 3. You'll notice if you leave out chapter 2, the flow, the grammar, the style, all of it continues rather without skipping a beat. These, at times, when we see these transitions in the text, they're marks that this story about the spies and Rahab could have been put into the original story later. Now, there are reasons for this, and we're going to cover that. But the question we might ask ourselves is, why is this story here? Why could it possibly even have been inserted into maybe a more primitive original story of how Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land? There's a lot of reasons for this, but there's really a rich irony going on here as we read this story that plays against Israel's failures before and after this episode. It's interesting that in this story, Rahab is the hero. She's the hero of the stories, while the spies, well, they're a little hapless, and the king of Jericho and his men are even more so. So our story opens in chapter 2, verse 1, and we read Joshua's formal title. And it's the only time we see his name written this way early in the book of Joshua, Joshua, son of Nun. He's not referred to that way elsewhere, at least in these early chapters of the book of Joshua. And it says that he sends 2 spies. Now, it's not like the 12 spies that Moses sent out before, which came back from the land, and 2 of the spies, one of which was Joshua and the other Caleb, who said, the land is ready for the taking, but the other 10 said, the land's inhabited with giants, we'll never be able to overcome them. It was that event, that moment when Moses sent the 12 spies out to look at the land and come back, that eventually caused them to wander in the wilderness for 40 more years before this episode takes place in Joshua chapter 2. Now, they're sent from a city called Shittim. It's an important place. It's on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So the Jordan River runs north to south, and it connects the Sea of Galilee in the north to the Dead Sea in the south. And the eastern side of the Jordan River is considered Moab territory, or the Moabites. And the western side of the Jordan River at this point in time is the land of the Canaanites. Now, Shittim's an important place on the eastern shore of the Jordan River, roughly across the river from where Jericho was located. You might recall that there's a story in Numbers chapter 25 about this same place. And in that story, under Moses' leadership, the Israelites camped there while they were in Moab, and they engaged while they're in idolatrous acts with the women of Moab, likely including some kind of sexual acts or prostitution. And they worshiped the Canaanite god named Baal. And so Moses, after hearing about this terrible thing that occurred at Shittim in Moab, had all of the Israelites who worshiped the image of Baal, it's a Canaanite god, had them put to death. Same place. So it's almost like 40 years later, we're back at that same place again. Wash, rinse, and go for it. And remember the instructions that Joshua gave to the 2 spies who have no name, just 2 spies. He said, I want you to go view the land, and especially Jericho. Now, Jericho is on the western side of the Jordan River, but it's not right next to the Jordan River. It's set back a ways from the river, about 5 or 6 miles. The modern city of Jericho is set back even more. It's about 7 or 8 miles from the river itself. So you just got to understand, river running north and south. On the eastern side is Shittim and Moab. On the western side is Jericho and Canaan. Now, Canaan is not a nation that has any unified sense of structure. It's not like it's the nation of Canaan. It's that the Canaanites lived there, and they were basically kind of a collection of city-states, and Jericho's one of them. So each city-state had its own regent or king over it. In this case, it's the king of Jericho. Now, what happens here in the story becomes a little interesting, because the spies, it says, the instruction was to go view the land, and especially Jericho. Well, according to Joshua's story in Joshua 2, the spies went directly to Jericho. And here's where the story, well, it gets a little spicy with some innuendo that's used. And the writing of this in Hebrew is really rather coy and careful. It's not accidental. It says, so they went and entered the house. Now, the word for entered, that Hebrew verb, that's the same exact verb in the same exact form it's used to describe sexual intercourse. And they found a prostitute there named Rahab. The root meaning of Rahab is to be opened to. And it was typically regarded as a slang word for a woman's sexual anatomy, Rahab. And then it says in the New American Standard Bible that the men rested there. That's not exactly what it says in Hebrew. This is part of where the story has some interesting meaning here. It's the same Hebrew verb that we see time and time again to lie with, and it is used to describe the sexual act in Hebrew. So it's almost like the writer's trying to make this kind of linguistic innuendo that the spies went to the house of a prostitute and they secured the services one would normally get from a prostitute. The words are choice. An innuendo is kind of all over the story, though. But I want you to keep in mind, now let's read the text a little more carefully. Each of these words has loaded meaning in Hebrew, especially with regard to the sexual act and sexual anatomy. But notice how they're rendered in the story, and that's what makes this such an artfully told tale. Innuendo is everywhere, but keep in mind, it says they didn't, when it says they entered, it says they didn't enter Rahab, it says they entered the house. And it says that Rahab then opened her residence, not herself, and to lie with is an understanding that it's quite likely that Rahab's home is also an inn and a tavern. If it was a brothel of some kind, there's a Hebrew word to say that, doesn't say that. If it was a place of temple or ritualized prostitution, there's a word to say that, and it doesn't say that. And so what we begin to understand is the writer is kind of using these hot words that spice the story up, but in reality, these words are kind of turned on end to describe what's really going on here. The spies went to this house and saw Rahab the prostitute who was there, and that's where they were going to stay the night, because probably it was some kind of inn that was located in the city wall of Jericho. So the question remains is, why do the spies go there? Maybe it's easy and accessible. Maybe it's a good place to practice their spy craft. Regardless of all these kind of literary innuendos that are sitting here in the text in Hebrew, the spies have made their way there, and they're going to be discovered. Now, Rahab, though, is a prostitute, and she's at home, and we learn later in the story that up on the roof of her house are bundles of flax laid out in an orderly fashion. So this isn't a simple situation here. This is really complex in what's going on. We can only put together pieces based on some of these descriptions of what may be happening here. It's interesting that it's described as her house. So she owns the house, which means a socioeconomic situation that she has with no male covering. Likely she could have been a prostitute, because that was the only way a woman without a husband or a father could possibly even have a chance to make any kind of income. But the story is interesting even further, and it says that she had flax on her roof, and that's where she hid the two spies. And flax, when it was harvested, was commonly put out in the open overnight so it could collect the morning dew, because flax was used to make fabric. And so by allowing moisture to get onto the flax, it swelled it slightly so that it could then be pulled apart into threads and then made into fabric. She's probably some kind of businesswoman in varied trades. She's a fabric maker if she's got flax on the roof. She's probably the inn manager and, according to the story, a prostitute. So, verse 2 tells us that the king of Jericho hears that the spies have arrived there at Rahab's house. And this is all part of the humor of the story now. So not only does the story start out with kind of this sexual innuendo, but then it kind of stretches even further and it becomes a little bit humorous. So apparently the king of Jericho has some remarkable systems for gathering intelligence. He has his own spies, and his own spies tell him that spies have come from the Israelites across the river into the city, and they're at Rahab's house. And so the king sends his men there to investigate this and tells Rahab, turn the men over to me. So for all of the capacity the king has in his intelligence gathering systems to know that these spies have arrived and stayed at Rahab's house, what happens next is actually part of the humor of the story. So verse 4 tells us that she hid the spies, and then she offered a response to the king's messengers. And she says something like this, that these men came to me. That's true. I did not know where they were from. That's sort of true. She may not have known where they were from when they arrived, but after she engaged with them, she probably figured out where they were from. And then she says, when it was time to shut the gate, the men went out. Well, that's just an outright lie. And then she says, I don't know where the men went. That's also an outright lie. And then she says, pursue them quickly for you'll overtake them. So she sends them on an errand that has no way of possibly finding any solution for the men who are searching for the spies. So now not as only is it a lie, but now it's a deceit filled with a lie. So explaining her lie, like trying to make sense of the ethic of this and that how she lies about this in some ways is missing the whole point. There are quite a few theologians and scholars that spend quite some time trying to parse out the ethical implications of Rahab's lie. And I think investing too much time in that is missing the whole point. This is about the economy of the moment. You know, Jesus tells a parable about this kind of situation, very much similar to what Rahab was experiencing in Luke chapter 16 with the parable of the unrighteous steward. I encourage you to read it, Luke 16, verses 1 to 13, about this kind of shrewdness and deception and even a bit of stretching truth. Well, like a good comedy, if you let this thing play out, the king's men and the king himself, they don't bother looking in the house. They don't even question what she said. They just take her word for it. And what's an interesting turn of the story is the king has intelligence that these two spies are in her house. They knock on the door. She says, gosh, they're not here. Maybe they just left. You could catch them. They just take that at face value and leave. So the king's capacity to lead is kind of represented in kind of an oafish sort of way. He doesn't go in the house. He doesn't question her. He doesn't have a stakeout at the house to see if the spies come out later and she's been lying to them. Nothing. They just leave and go look for the spies outside the city walls. Verse 6, though, tells us exactly what she did do. She brought them up to the roof, which was the most private part of the house, hid them in stalks of flax. And it could have been that her home, the ground floor was the tavern, the inn was on the upper floors, and the residence where she lived was on top, the roof. So continuing like a good comedy, the king's men pursue them on the road to the Jordan to look for the places where they could have crossed the river. You remember, Jericho sits on the river plain west of the Jordan, and Shittim is on the east side of the Jordan. So the king and his men are somehow strangely aware the spies are at Rahab's, but they just believe her. So once the king's men are gone, the door to the city shut. But that also now means that the spies themselves are trapped, that they have no way to get out of the city. So at no point in this story are the spies heralded as being very effective. Remember the instructions that were given to them. Go, check out the land, and especially Jericho. That's what they're told to do. And their first stop is a tavern with an inn featuring a well-known prostitute. It opens a key passageway to us. That vision for God's coming future demands obedience to the Spirit more than the letter. Vision for God's coming future demands obedience to the Spirit more than the letter. And what I'm speaking of here is the spirit of the law than the letter of the law. This story is really a rich spy drama filled with inept spies, a king who's a bit of a fool, and a calculating, shrewd, intelligent woman. Rahab knows exactly what's at stake and moves to preserve herself and her family, as we'll see in a moment. Jesus speaks often of zeal for the kingdom of God. He says in the Gospels, unless you hate your father, your mother, your brother or sister, you cannot be my disciple. He says that unless you become a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, for it is better for you to go to the kingdom of God with a missing eye than it is to be cast into hell. We sometimes struggle to make God a part of our life. And if that's our frame, we might be missing the whole point. What has to happen here, and what Rahab is beginning to demonstrate to us, is that we must wholly give ourselves to being part of God's life, His kingdom, His grace. We now turn to verses 8 to 14 with Rahab's confession and her bargain. Our story continues in the same strange way, as Rahab makes this great confession, strikes a bargain with the two spies. Verse 8 continues with our innuendo in the story. Remember that spicy language. It says, before the spies lay down. Well, what does that mean in a prostitute's house? Rahab returns to the roof, and she has a conversation with the spies once the king's men has left. She says in verse 9, I know that the Lord has given you the land. And the word there for Lord is Yahweh. She knows the covenant name for God. She then reports that everyone in Canaan is in despair, knows all about him. We heard about you parting the Red Sea when you left Egypt. We heard about what you did to the Amorites. Beyond the Jordan, our hearts melted and no courage remained within us. But what she says next is the showstopper. She says in the concluding part of her statement, before she gets into the deal she wants to make, she says this, for the Lord your God. She names Yahweh once more, but not in the first person, the second. For the Lord your God, not my God, but your God. She then says this, he is God in heaven above and earth below. This is the core creed of a pillar of Jewish theology within a certain school and tradition. It's called the Deuteronomistic tradition. It's the tradition that's really spelled out in Deuteronomy. You'll find that she repeats it word for word perfectly. He is God in heaven above and earth below. It's exactly the way it's written in Deuteronomy. This same phrase is in the book of Numbers once. It's in Deuteronomy twice. In Deuteronomy, it's in 2 of the 10 commandments themselves. You see, in Canaan, the gods were all varied. There were some gods in heaven. There were some gods on earth. There were some gods even in between. And this is why this creed that she said, he is God in heaven above and earth below, is so important in her tradition. Yahweh encompasses all domains. Not just in heaven, not just on earth, not just in between, but in heaven, earth, and in between. And this is why some people believe that, some scholars believe that this story was added a little bit later. It provides the context for a confession of faith that she makes. And it gives an apologetic for holy war. And what this means is that in the story, she makes an affirmation of faith. She confesses the Israelites' God in the exact perfect way that it would have been heard by the Israelite people. And that makes her the first Canaanite to make a confession of Israel's God. And that's the theological point of the story in some ways. The point of the story isn't that she was shrewd and she hid the spies and there's this comedy that ensues with the king's men going out looking. That's not, in some sense, not the theological point of the story. The theological point of the story is that even a Canaanite prostitute who confesses belief in Yahweh will be saved. So now she's got the upper hand on those who will soon have the upper hand on her. She has the upper hand on the 2 spies, but the nation of Israel will have the upper hand on her. She decides to strike a deal. She asks them to swear by Yahweh. She invokes the covenant name for God a 3rd time. And she says, since she's dealt kindly with them, they should kindly deal with her father's household. And she tells them to give her a pledge of truth. See, this bargain that she's striking is about reciprocation. She took care of the spies. Now she wants the spies to go tell the Israelites to take care of her, her father, her mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, to save them from death. She knows the Israelites will attempt to take the city, but how will she live? Well, the spies, who now really have no choice, tell her that if she doesn't say anything about them, then Rahab and her entire family will be saved when the city is taken by Israel. And that's the final key passageway for us. That salvation is offered freely for those who choose it. This story paints the king, the king's men, and even the spies as a bit, dumb. Rahab, whose name means to be open, now redefines her name. Not around some sort of crude sexual anatomy. No. She now is open in terms of being spiritually open, a readiness to know Israel's God, the one true God. She's open to the relationship she can have. And we learn later in Joshua 6 how she is honored. As a matter of fact, if you turn to Matthew's gospel and look in Matthew's earliest chapter, you'll see the genealogy of Jesus, and Rahab is listed there. The story turns this whole innuendo of the prostitute and in a trade that is regarded as so sinful. She turns the whole thing on its ear. She believes and thus is saved. And this is encouraging to us too. There's no limit to God's redeeming grace and God's infinite love. What's left for us to do, and for every human being, is to simply choose it. I want to thank you for listening to the FFMC podcast. Listen in for our sermon podcast and our conversational podcast called Connections. You can find them all right here in the FFMC podcast. I also encourage you to visit our church's website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.